Welcome back. Well, yes, we can't talk about these things enough. Or what's the option? We sit back and fold our arms? That's certainly not an option. So, yes, we've got Mr. Muda Yusuf joining us now. He is the CEO, Center for the Promotion of Private Enterprise, CPPE, but he's a former Director General, Lagos Chamber of Commerce and Industry. Good morning. Good to see you again, sir.
Good morning, Chamberlain.
Let's take you through some of these figures. I mean, you know them already, but just to refresh our memories, if we talk about the excess crude account, just look at it at a glance, because it was established in 2004 by the federal government at the time to ensure that they cushioned the impact of the change in oil revenue and try to stabilize the economy. And then it was funded, that's the way it was funded actually, by the difference between the market price of crude oil and the budget benchmark. But in 2011, a more structured system, the Sovereign Wealth Fund, was introduced, and then was to be funded by the ECA. But look at the excess crude account balance. If you flip to that next one now, in 2005, when it took off, you can see that it had $5.1 billion at the time. Let's flip to that, guys. And then in 2008, $20 billion. In 2010, $4 billion. 2013, $9 billion. 2015, $2.3 billion. In 2018, precisely in November 2018, it was $2.3 billion. And then in December 2018, $631 million. So just note that. And then in 2020, $72 million. In May 2022, $35 million. But we're in July now. But in June this year, 376,655. So, raises some concern there. But, Mr. Yusuf, looking through all of these figures, I know that you've spoken severally about some of the strategies, what's going on, what kind of steps are we taking to see how we can address it. But from what you've seen now, what do you think of this?
Yeah, thank you very much. First of all, I think we need to worry more about the historical context from this figure that you have read out now. You can see that we are coming from over 20 billion US dollars to where we are today. This administration, I'm talking about the Buhari administration, I think inherited about $2.3 billion of this sum. So between Jonathan, between maybe Yaradua, Jonathan, we have seen a massive depletion of this excess crude. And I recall that even at the time, the former finance minister at that time, Dr. Okonjo-Iweala, had a running battle with the state governments.
About us saving.
About not saving, one. About the constitutionality of the excess crude account.
Yeah.
In fact, all the state governments actually took the federal government to court. Twice.
They didn't want to save.
They didn't want to save, that is one. Secondly, they said it was not constitutional. That what the law says is that whatever revenue we earn should go into the federation account and it should be distributed. And I remember the minister at that time telling them that we were saving for the raining days. And they said the rain was already here. So what are we talking about? So there was a lot of pushback to this. But for me, I think what is critical when we interrogate these kind of figures is the trend from where it was at over 20 billion US dollars to where we are now. Because under this administration, in fairness to them, we are talking about from 2.3 billion to where we are. And the nature of the excess crude is that it is treated as a fund in the federation accounts. The federal government doesn't have the sole authority over it. And the minister said that much.
Even though we heard some arguments as to how it's being administered at the moment. But
yeah, of course, there were arguments as to, but the principle is that it can only be spent in consultation
with the
state
states
governments, and even possibly with the federal. Because I remember, even during Obasanjo era, there was some massive investment in the IPP, that's integrated power plants. Part of the fund that was used for that major push was also from the SS Crude. And now, under this administration, at least we have been told now that first, the major deduction was for this Kano jets and some of these things, which was $1 billion US.
Yeah.
And that was done in consultation with the state government. Of course, I understand that some of the state governors kicked against it. I think Wike and Fayose or something kicked against it at that time. But that was what it was used for. Now, the latest withdrawal was about also for the Navy to buy some vessels for, to ensure maritime security and so on.
And oil bunkering and things like that.
And all of those things. So for me, the bigger issue and the big story is the current financial crisis. It's not so much of this depletion of crude, excess reserve from 2 billion to about 300 and something thousand. That is not. If you want to talk about the depletion, we have to take it historically.
Is it a source of concern?
20, yes.
Rather, that is from $2.3 billion. That is when this government came into power. We can talk about the $20 billion in the Obasanjo time. But does it concern you that from $2.3 billion, we're now at $376,000 with the excess?
It concerns me. But what concerns me more within the context of this discussion is the fact that we are coming from over $20 billion US. We are not talking about that. That is one. Secondly, we can see the facts that have been put on the table. We have very serious security issues. They had to buy all this Kano jet and all of that. Whether we are getting the result from that is a different matter. But it was something that was needed. It needed to be done. Then the latest deduction was again about maritime security.
Mr. Yusuf,
because for security, you cannot spare any effort.
Mr. Yusuf,
look at where we are.
Mr. Yusuf, should that be a different matter? Or shouldn't the argument be that, okay, indeed, the funds have been spent on security, and then we're seeing the gains on security, and then if there's security, we can begin to rebuild on that for the economy to begin to thrive? Should we dismiss the fact that we're not seeing the gains if indeed the funds have been spent on security?
No, there are different issues. The initial justification was that this was spent for security. That is fine. But if you are not getting the right kind of outcomes, I think that should be of concern to everybody.
But
because the situation seems to be deteriorating, in spite of all the amount, even beyond the SS Crude. We see the annual budget, we see how much have been budgeted for defense, and yet we are where we are. That's of course, it's a major concern.
Absolutely. So that talks about the transparency and accountability of using those funds. But still back on the excess crude account. In 2018, the Minister of Finance, or the ministry this time around, spoke about, yes, the funds for security, but also for the Paris Club refunds that was paid to state. And in the words of, I think, the permanent secretary, saying that the final payment for Paris Club refund to state was made and the figure was deducted from the ECA. So that was at the time it depleted from $2.3 billion to, I think, about $631 million. So maybe security is understood to a large extent, even though it's debatable. But the Paris Club refunds, and I remember questions then, why was the money taken from there? Was that really what it is meant for? So maybe security is understandable, but for the Paris Club refunds, because that's when we started seeing a major depletion, do you think that's justifiable as well?
Well, I think there are some constitutional arguments at that time, by the states, that these funds legitimately belongs to them. And don't forget, we have also been talking about moving our dispensation as close as possible to a proper federation, at least within the context of the Constitution. So the argument by the states was that these funds belong to us, and it has to be given to us. So if it belongs to them, then of course they are entitled to it. So whether they now want to save it or they want to spend it, it depends on them.
So doesn't that speak to the
And that is why
thinking?
we have the legislative arm of government who are supposed to be representatives of the people. They are supposed to check the executive on behalf of the people on how the finances of state are managed. So if the legislative arm have not been doing what they are supposed to do, then we know that you have a major issue with our democracy.
It's interesting you mentioned the legislature, because in 2017, they actually called for the scrapping of the ECA and said all the money should go into the TSA. But when we go back, two issues you talked about, the thinking that maybe we shouldn't save. And I wonder why we think that way, that we shouldn't save for the future. But also, when you look at one of the basic purposes of the ECA is at least the difference in the benchmark for crude and what crude is sold at the market. We're meant to at least save those funds since our budget is planned on the benchmark. So we've seen oil prices at over $100. Yes, we're not producing as much, but I think that balances out the fact that oil prices have since doubled as well. So if we're making more from crude, why aren't we saving to some extent at least?
Well, let me take you back to the issue of the Constitution. There was this argument by the state that the ECA itself was not constitutional. You have to run the country according to the Constitution. It's not in the Constitution. So if they argue that way, you cannot fault them. But the logic of saving is a fantastic idea. It's a fantastic concept. You know, you don't eat with all your 10 fingers. You have to save. That is why we have the Sovereign Wealth Fund. We had it was set up with $1 billion at that time.
There was a controversy around that too as well.
But at least it's been managed well. We have very sound professional team managing the Sovereign Wealth Fund. And the fund is still there. And it has about 3 components. There's the infrastructure fund. They are part of the people supporting the Niger Bridge and some other infrastructure projects. There is the Future Generations Fund. That is to prepare for the future generation. That is something to show them that this is some of the legacy work that we left for you. Then there is the Stabilization Fund. The Stabilization Fund is to support the government when there is a major fiscal crisis. And I know that during when we had the pandemic, the federal government drew some money from the Sovereign Wealth Fund. But it's still very, very small. We are talking of $1 billion. A country like Norway has $1.3 trillion. Our economy is bigger than the economy of Norway. You know?
The constitutionality
and so many countries like that.
Regardless of the constitutionality of the excess crude accounts, let's look at the argument of the Minister of Finance now saying that the reason we've not had accretion to the ECA is because of the volatility of the oil price in the international market. How do you view that argument? Is it legitimate?
Well, generally, I'm not sure that the administration has also been very prudent in the management of resources, generally. And that is part of the reason we also find ourselves in this crisis, you know. But apart from the volatility of oil price, there is also the issue of the oil output. Because consistently, our oil output has been falling short of budget targets. It has been falling short of the OPEC quota, you know. So these are some of these. Because if you have the high oil price and you have a major shortfall in your output, sometimes it just cancels out, and you are not able to save. And in any case, the way we have carried on, at least in the past few years, does not show a disposition to save. It does not show sufficient prudence in the management of our finances. You know, I think that is part of the challenges that have brought us to a situation now that we have a major fiscal crisis, where we are spending more to service debt than the revenue that we are earning, which is a major issue. That means that all the funding of either the personnel costs, the overhead costs, capital projects, everything is now coming from borrowing. That is, of course, it's not sustainable, and it's a very frightening situation. So we need to worry about the way the finances are managed first on the expenditure side, because the way government has been spending does not show that we have a revenue challenge over the years, because there has been no serious efforts to cut down on expenditure. And some of the information, some of the statements even from the finance ministry and all of that does not indicate that we are committed to doing anything about expenditure. There was a time they even said there was nothing we could do about expenditure. I mean, that cannot fly. So we have a whole lot of issues.
Mr. Yusuf, if I may come in.
Okay. I was.
Thank you. Good morning.
Okay,
I just wanted to quickly, I share the fright that you feel. I'm sure a lot of Nigerians do as well. I think it's even more frightening when you think about the fact that this is happening across all tiers of government. Part of the argument back then, I think between 2011 and 2013, even going up to 2015, when they were talking about putting more money, even establishment of the Sovereign Wealth Fund and putting more money to the Sovereign Wealth Fund, a lot of the states were arguing then that they could do their savings by themselves, that they did not need the federal government to save for them. But sadly, down the line, this is how many years down the line, we have not seen any state lead by example to say, look, we're in our budget, we're also putting some money aside for the rainy day. Should we also be looking at how the states have managed their finances so far with a view to putting pressure on them to say, you too can do something?
Exactly. We need to engage the states a lot more. Because when you look at even the whole system of transparency, accountability, we seem to even be having more openness in terms of finances, financial information, expenditure information at the federal level than at the state level. You can Google the federal government budget and see details of how monies are spent, even up to the cutleries that are being used in the State House. It's there on the website. But how many states have that kind of openness in terms of their expenditure? So in terms of accountability, in fact, the situation seems to be even much worse at the subnationals than even at the federal. Because there is no disclosure, no information. What you get most times are just summary of what the budget is. And that's it. And the kind of engagement that you have between the National Assembly and the executive, at least in previous parliaments, not this parliament, was such that there was some interrogation of the executive. But at the state level, you hardly can distinguish between the legislature and the executive. So the kind of checks and balances that we expect to see at the state level, we are not seeing it. And it's even worse at the local government level. We don't even hear anything about it. At least it's also a tier of government. No information, nothing. You just hear that they have gotten the allocation, and that's it. And we hear stories of some local governments where people only gather when the allocation has landed. Once they finish distributing the allocation, everybody disperses. Yeah. And that has been the trend in many of the local governments. So in terms of accountability...
So how can we reverse? How do you think we can reverse this trend? Whilst we're really, really worried, and as we ought to be about the current state of things, what do you think that we can do to, pressure? I know that there's been, even the World Bank has had to intervene in recent times, asking for more transparency in states. But the World Bank's intervention is going to come to an end, I think, by December this year or so. How do you think that we can sustain this need for transparency on the parts of the states?
Well, first, the citizens have a very big role to play. Because as citizens, what we often do is that after voting, we just go to bed until another 4 years. And democracy is about inclusion, it's about participation, it's about demanding accountability. So the citizens' role in our democracy is extremely very weak. We don't ask questions, we don't interrogate anything, except for a few NGOs or civil society organizations have taken it upon themselves to interrogate and question some of these issues, finances, expenditure, accountability, and so on and so forth. We have had a series of audit reports. How much of it was, there was no action, practically. And in all the states, have anybody heard anything about any audit reports? You know? So these are issues. Citizen participation is extremely weak. We need to activate that in order to strengthen this democracy. We need to also engage our parliaments, our state assemblies. Their function is to engage the executive. Their function is to act on behalf of the people to check the checks and balances. Not a situation where the legislative arm will practically collapse into the executive arm, and you can't even draw the line.
You know, listening to you throughout, one thing that seems to come through is, because right from the inception of the excess crude account formation, the arguments that came through, they didn't want to save. Even this government, you've seen a number of governments say, no, scrap it. It's hiding under the fact that it's not constitutional. Then you talk about the budgeting system. You see the attitude of what comes through, how they seem to say one thing, but the actions seem to say the other. And attitude across board seems to stand out as though it doesn't appear as though we're really approaching this thing as though we're thinking about the consequences, the implications of all of these actions on the country. Because, I mean, all of this appears as though when they say, no, don't save, bring it now, now, now. How do we go about correcting that particular attitude? I know you said we need to ask a lot more questions, because no matter the kind of policies we bring to bear, if the attitude of the people to carry that is not right, can we make any success?
We cannot. But you see, it depends on the quality of those in governance. Because this is about leadership. Even as bad as things were in terms of accountability, I remember the case of Peter Obi when he was governor of Anambra State. You know, the kind of savings he left as governor. And maybe one or two governors did the same thing. You know? Although there were arguments as to whether you needed to save when you had major infrastructure issues and all of that. But the principle that we needed to save was there. So it's a question of the kind of leaders that we have. Mm-hmm. So the ball is in our court as citizens to elect people that we know will be committed to true service and true leadership.
If I could...
That is basically the problem. And luckily, we are getting close to another election.
Right.
The choice is for us to make. If we elect people that sees politics as just an avenue to go and get some money, make money, and all of that, that is it. If you elect people who you really know are committed to service, that is the kind of thing we should be doing.
But, you know, there's this thinking that really does you engage? I mean, you said it. You don't vote and then go to sleep. And I'd quickly like to take this excerpt from Dr. Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala's book, Fighting Corruption is Dangerous. And she was talking about the excess crude account and some of the back and forths. And they said around 2014, the chief opponent of these arguments to deposit savings in the Sovereign Wealth Fund, or the ECA, was Governor Chibuike Amechi of Rivers State, the chair of Nigeria Governors Forum at the time. He was strongly supported by Governor Adams Oshiomhole of Edo State, who was very vocal in voicing his disapproval and suspicions of the federal government's management of the ECA. Of course, Governor Babatunde Fashola of Lagos State, senior advocate of Nigeria on a constitutional basis, Governor Godswill Akpabio, and a host of governors. And she said that, you know, others, such as Governor Peter Obi of Anambra State, argued for savings. And I think you referenced that, but they were not supported. And I wonder, so people had elected those governors into power. What could they have done at that point? Because when it was time to take decisions, it was the people they elected that took the decisions for them, and essentially we have to live with those decisions. So what can people do in the middle, after you've done elections, to ensure that such decisions that don't essentially reflect maybe what we want for our future are not taken?
You see, there is the issue of trust between the federal and the subnationals. That played out in what you said. Because if as a state government, I don't trust the federal authorities, and they say they want to save for me, I have a right to say no. Give me the money. I am the one that will determine my own priorities. It comes back to the issue of running a true federal structure. Because we have to get back to that. Because even the ECA, there were allegations along the line that some withdrawals were made without consultation with the government, with the state government.
But the Sovereign Wealth Fund had a law backing it.
Yes.
So that's, I mean, the ECA, yes, I mean, didn't quite have an operational framework per se, but the Sovereign Wealth Fund had an operational framework, a law, so it was clear what to expect. So why was still the back and forth?
Well, it depends on what the priority, or what each state governor feels that is his priority. You feel that you have bigger things to do with your money, you can put that on the table.
Mr. Yusuf, talk to us about
it's neither here nor there.
Talk to us about solutions. What should we be doing to address the financial economic situation of this country at the moment?
You see, the financial situation, first as I said, is very troubling. And when you are dealing with issues of finance and fiscal or financial sustainability, you look at it from two sides. You look at it from the expenditure side, and you look at it from the revenue side. Because those are the two sides of the equation that determines sustainability. On the expenditure side, we need to be a lot more prudent. All along, across board, there is no evidence that there was any sense that we have a financial problem. We are spending as though there was no problem, just like spending business as usual. So that culture, that sense of urgency, about being prudent in the way you manage resources, that has to be there. Because all along, people are just spending money, and the cost of governance has been increasing. Right. So when you have a situation where the cost of governance has been increasing, at a time when your revenue is shrinking, you are bound to have this kind of crisis. So that discipline to cut expenditure has to be there across board. Then, of course, we need to look at our revenue. How do we deal with issues of revenue? Now, for instance, we had the problem of this oil theft.
And it's increasing.
It's increasing. I mean, how can we allow such a situation to get so entrenched?
It's part of the investments to stop oil bunkering,
yes,
and things like that.
So that people will be loading into vessels. We are not talking about people stealing phone or stealing something. You are stealing crude and you are loading vessels. And people are shipping that out of the country. It's a major failure of governance.
So,
So a lot of revenue has been lost. Then we have even the general management of our finances. You have seen several audit reports, at least at the federal level. Even at the state, we don't even hear of any audit report. But at the federal, how many people have been called to account?
Well, there are just
Some
so
of
many.
them with damning queries and interrogations as to how some of the agencies of government have been spending money.
We can't even talk about the cases within the courts now about billions of naira for officials of government who have been tried for stealing billions.
Not just billion, we are talking of 80 billion, 100 billion.
Wow.
That's an indication of how bad the situation with corruption has been. And this is also one of the major factors.
I think we need no telling to say that the economy has got to be the front burner for the elections. So whoever is coming in needs to tell us how they plan to fix the economy. We look at what they've done before, what can they do moving forward. So because if we don't face all of those things, I guess you know what to come. But I want to thank you for coming on. As always, Mr. Muda Yusuf is the CEO, Center for the Promotion of Private Enterprise, CPPE, and is the former Director General of Lagos Chamber of Commerce and Industry. We will be back in a moment, still talking about what is going on in the polity and how to address them. Don't go away.